If you compare the ages of farmers to the civilian labor force more broadly, it's pretty astounding. So 6.6% of the US labor force is over the age of 65, but 40% of farmers are over the age of 65. And for every one farmer that's between the ages of 25 to 34, there are two farmers that are over the age of 75. So I think it's going to be a challenge for the industry going forward. One, two, three.
Coming up, we're nerding out on ag economics, specifically focused on the recent ag census and California agriculture. The Modern Acre podcast explores the latest in business, investing, technology, and sustainability in agriculture, and we're your hosts, Tyler and Tim Nuss. If you'd like to dig deeper with the Modern Acre, be sure to check out our membership community, the Modern Acre Co-op. We actually just had a members call this week talking about first-time fund managers and raising capital in agriculture. This is just one example of the member calls that we have every other month in the Modern Acre community. So if you want to check out a recording of that episode, check the link in the show notes to join the Modern Acre Co-op. The Modern Acre podcast is presented by Pinion. In today's challenging ag environment, the success of a farm rises and falls based on making sound decisions. Pinion advisors recommend evaluating your farm data regularly to maximize profits and identify threats to your bottom line. If you don't have time or resources, Pinion can help. Farmers have entrusted Pinion with their businesses for 90 years. From ag-focused tax and accounting strategy, legacy planning, and FSA program guidance to business management, land advisory, sustainability, and more. Explore your options at pinionglobal.com. Big shout out to Pinion, our latest sponsor for the podcast. We use Pinion on our farm and have seen a ton of value from using their services. They do it all, Tim. They're kind of like the Swiss Army knife firm for ag. So be sure to check them out. Hit the link in our show notes. We're super excited to partner with them for the next few months.
Ty, I'm super pumped for today's episode. We're talking USDA farm census. We're talking the outlook of agriculture in California. We're talking to Matt Woolf, who's a specialty crop analyst for Terrain. He really focuses on tree nuts, fruits, and vegetables. He's a California native and comes from a farming family. He also has a Ph.D., so it's nice to bring in the big guns to when we're talking about this kind of subject matter, Ty.
Totally. It was awesome just to get his perspective and insights into what is happening in the ag economy. I think was just great to look at some data, to look at his perspectives of the economic climate, what's causing some of these things, right? It's one thing to look at the numbers, but it's another thing to analyze it and actually provide valuable insights into what is going on and how farmers should make decisions based on that.
Totally. For those of you that aren't familiar, Terrain is an offering from American Ag Credit and Farm Credit Services of America that delivers exclusive insight and confident forecasting into market areas that have an impact for their customers' business. So we're an American Ag Credit customer and became aware of Terrain through that relationship. So it's a really cool offering that they provide to their community, covering a whole range of crops. Matt's focuses on specialty crops, but they also cover row crops and livestock and dairy and a bunch of other industries as well. So if you check out their website, they have a lot of good content there.
All right, Tim, let's jump into this conversation with Matt with what's top of mind for him.
Yeah, so for me, top of mind has been where to go with some of the reports that I've put out recently. I've done quite a bit of research on different permanent crops in California, particularly almonds and walnuts, which, as I know you guys know, aren't in a great position right now in terms of profitability. We've just seen prices that are extremely low, way below break even, and then costs that just keep on going up, which is never a good combination. So I'm thinking a lot about those commodities and where we're headed with those. In terms of other projects I'm thinking about as a researcher, one is definitely the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. So SGMA, this is this huge piece of legislation that's really forcing a lot of areas that have been pumping a lot of groundwater to get to sustainability by 2040 and to better understand what that means for different commodities in the Central Valley. So that's one area. And then another area is trying to understand where a lot of these costs in agriculture production in the state are coming from, and breaking that down into a couple of different categories to understand how those costs are being driven and what parts of those costs are most important or increasing the most.
Super excited to dig into that. The reports you've been putting out, I've just been consuming them so much, really good and valuable information, and want to dig into all those items. But before we jump in, Matt, maybe let's learn a little bit more about you and what led you into agricultural research.
Yeah, so my background kind of has two separate strands to it. The first is I was born in an agricultural family down in Fresno County. So we grow almonds, pistachios, tomatoes. We do some processing as well, almond processing and tomato processing. So from a very young age, I was forced to work on the farm, often against my will and quite literally kicking and screaming at times. I actually have one memory of being taken out to Huron to work on the farm when I was probably in, I don't know, 8th grade or maybe a freshman in high school. And I tried to hitchhike with my brother back to Fresno. And my dad caught us and was like, nope, you gotta go back. And so that's kind of the ag side. I then, I must have liked something about it because I started my own small tomato farm in Lemoore for a while, growing, processing tomatoes. And so that's really the ag side. It's kind of on the ground work, moving lay flat around, that kind of thing. And then on the economic side, after high school, I moved to Australia. My dad had a pistachio project out there, and it kind of put Australia in my mind. And so I studied economics out there from the undergrad level to the Ph.D. level, and taught economics out there with a focus on macro. So more high level. And so those are kind of the two strands that led me to terrain. So, looking at or doing farm work that was very hands-on, and then looking at the economy from a very high level, and being able to combine those two things in agricultural research is really exciting.
All right. So tell us, what is terrain? What's terrain all about?
Yeah, so Terrain's a group of economists that work within the farm credit system. We work with American Ag Credit, Frontier Farm Credit, and Farm Credit Services of America. And so we have 7 different analysts looking at a bunch of different commodities, from beef to wheat, from macro rural economy stuff, wine, just kind of all across the board. And it's really a service for our customers to better understand the markets that they're involved with. A lot of times farmers are extremely busy. Running a farm is extremely time intensive and labor intensive. And so even though they might understand these broader trends in a more general way, Terrain's able to provide research insights and reports to understand that stuff for a lot of those producers that don't have the time to, go through a bunch of USDA data.
Totally. Yeah. From our perspective, we're a farm credit customer, and became aware of a terrain through that of hey, we have analysts on staff that could help provide some guidance on crops you're growing, particularly in California. And that's how we originally got in touch. But I think it's a huge value proposition versus other banks that don't have that service, that are just kind of, we'll give you the money, but not necessarily the economic guidance. So that's really cool that they've built that out. So want to dig in here. Where to start? Maybe let's start with almonds. You mentioned that you've done some reporting on them. Give us the lay of land on almonds. From an outsider's view, we don't grow almonds on our farm. We're more vegetables, and we've seen almond production just blow up in the Lodi area, around us in the Delta. And my dad's our grandfather wouldn't believe that there's almond orchards out in the Delta. There's just almond trees where you've never would think they would be. So it's blown up in California. What's happening right now with almonds?
Yeah. So the main issue really is that there was a record 2020 crop of about 3 billion pounds. And then COVID hits, and it was very difficult to get shipments out of the Port of Oakland because of all the shipping drama that everyone read about. And so that uncommitted inventory piled up and resulted in record carryover numbers that really just put downward pressure on pricing. And so, it's really a tough situation with a lot of growers way below break even. I think we're in a bit of a more positive scenario at the moment than we were last year. The way I see it is 2022 is likely to be the bottom of that market. If you look at where we're headed with inventory and where we're headed with shipments. Shipments have been really quite strong this year. The month of January and January 2024 was a record for that month, which is really encouraging. And so I think we are in a better position. This crop that was just harvested is likely to be much smaller than what the USDA forecasted. So I think we're headed in the right direction. We're starting to see that reflected in the price, which is going up gradually. I said from the start that I think this is going to be a very gradual recovery. It's not going to all of a sudden jump up to $4, which is what it was in 2014. But I think we're headed in the right direction with almonds.
Yeah, super interesting. It's like one of those crops that gets talked about as like a heavy exported item. So like when a port shutdown happens, like and you're heavily committed to export, that has huge ramifications on the crop versus other crops that are more domestically focused.
Absolutely.
Matt, I want to dig into this a little bit more. I find this fascinating. I'm so jealous of you and your brain and your colleagues' brains looking into this. Like, I'm the perfect target customer of these types of reports of like, can you just distill this information to tell it to me like I'm 5 years old? This is great. So I think this is really interesting. I see a lot of parallels to even like the tech industry of interest rates. And it's almost like interest rates are a proxy for almond prices almost, of like you see high interest rates means money is not readily available. There needs to be an emphasis on short-term profitability. And it almost feels like it's the farmers that can weather this storm, for a bad analogy, that can get through this season of break even at best, but losing money at worst. Those that can weather that and have enough reserves, financing, et cetera, to get through that. Your position is there is kind of light at the end of the tunnel, but there's going to be farmers that are affected. Like we're seeing it in our area of almond groves going out. We've heard in the news recently of a few major farms like having to either file bankruptcy or liquidate their assets, et cetera, of almond orchards. Are you kind of seeing that similarly? Like maybe it's the farms that were over-levered and not as tight on their economics that are suffering, and the ones that maybe were a little bit more conservative, less leverage, are in a better position to weather this?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, definitely. I think, there's a lot of different types of people in agriculture, particularly in the Central Valley. You have so many different types of farmers. You have the more of the investor farmer who may be a doctor on the side, or a farmer on the side, but a doctor more full time. Then you have the family operations that have been there forever doing it. And so we're definitely seeing those who are over levered starting to feel the impact of interest rates in a pretty big way. It gets a little confusing because we're in kind of a strange economic time where we have interest rates, way higher than they've been for a very long time. But at the same time, we have this massive piece of legislation with SGMA, and so that it's a changing landscape in that sense. And so it's a little bit hard to fully extract each effect there. So there's obviously a lot going on. But yeah, I think it's a really difficult time more generally for permanent plantings. But at the same time, I think, when that's the case, there's also a lot of opportunity on the other side.
Matt, I want to jump into SGMA a little bit. We've talked about it here and there, but would love to kind of dive in and get your thoughts and fill our listeners in on what SGMA is and kind of the rollout.
Yeah, so SGMA was passed in 2014, and it requires groundwater basins in California that are critically overdrafted to get to sustainability by 2040. And what that means is that they have to stop over pumping, right? So they have to start recharging, have to think about where supply is coming from, and also think about demand and make sure that demand is not outstripping supply. The main areas that are affected are throughout the Central Valley, essentially all of the Central Valley, and then certain parts of Salinas. Those are the main areas that are going to be impacted by this legislation. It's really difficult to fully narrow in on what the total impact is going to be, but there have been some numbers thrown out there, about 500,000 acres taken out of production possibly. And so it's a pretty impactful piece of legislation that, I think a lot of farmers may not even realize that it's already in the process of being implemented. They might not be feeling the effects depending on where they are. I think one of the things that makes it really complicated is that it affects, even within the Central Valley, it affects areas so differently. Water in California is so hard to fully understand, and there's so many different nuances depending on where you are. And so, kind of a generalization is that the south part of the valley is going to be more impacted than the north part of the valley. But I think that's kind of something that I'm trying to explore in my next research project, is really trying to understand what this means for different commodities. So what does this mean for almonds? How many almond acres are in areas that only get, this amount of surface water, and therefore they're going to be more reliant on groundwater going forward.
It's crazy. I feel like I understand 10% of California water. It is. I feel like a few years ago, I finally understood like the water we use, is separate and distinct from groundwater, right? Like there's all these different mechanisms by farms receive water. I'm like, it's just water. You have water to irrigate your crops. And I, like being totally naive, don't understand, the complexities. I think I'm getting there, but
yeah. Though I heard a funny quote the other day. It's that the only thing more complicated than understanding California water is understanding dairy pricing.
That's good. That's how I feel about like certain stocks, that like the market says we want X, Y, and Z, and then a company delivers X, Y, and Z, and the stock goes down. Right. Like, yeah. Make it make sense. But so I want to pivot, and we're just rapid firing you. So appreciate this insight is awesome. Tim and I are just being selfish with it. So in the interest of being selfish, you talk about tomato pricing recently, and we grow processing tomatoes. So can you kind of fill us in on that report?
Yeah. So I was looking at the tomato market. Partially, this was selfish on my part. I grew them in the 2018 season when the prices were low and the costs were high, which is, as an economist, I really ought to know better. But that's when I grew them, and I think the price was maybe $70 a ton, something like that. It was $138 a ton last year, which is pretty extraordinary. And when you compare that to a lot of your options elsewhere, particularly in permanent plantings, not that you can easily go from tomatoes to permanent plantings and vice versa, but in a relative sense, the opportunity to grow tomatoes was never better than last year, according to some of those numbers. I think the challenge there, or something that report might, I say it in there, but something that should be re-emphasized is, I'm sure you guys know, tomatoes are extremely risky. A lot can go wrong. I certainly learned that. And so that's something that should be kept in mind there. But I do think we're kind of in an interesting time at the moment. If you look at, tomato prices, onion prices, a lot of row crop prices are actually going up or higher than they were 5 years ago. And then it's the opposite in permanent plantings. And so that's kind of something I'm going to investigate a little bit more in a future report. But it's kind of an interesting phenomenon because we were in a very different scenario 10 years ago, even 5 years ago.
Yeah, it seems like being in these commodity markets, it's very cyclical, where one's up, the other's down, and just kind of vice versa. And like farmers, when they see their neighbor making money doing something, they all go into the same crop, and that market blows up. And so it's constant up and downs. And yeah, tomatoes thing is interesting, where it was $138 last year, like really good price. And already hearing kind of the chatter for this year, like pricing's coming down. Like a lot of the processors are cutting acreage, prorating acres. Like we're hearing it could be around the 115 range. So like that off the top is probably $1,000 in revenue loss just in the price going down, with inputs staying relatively flat.
Yeah. Oh, I'm hearing the same thing. 110, 115, somewhere in there. The number of acres contracted, according to the January report, is a lot lower than it was last year. So, I think that's what's happening, is the industry's trying to not get in a situation where there's too much inventory out there, which it's done in the past. Totally.
Are you tracking like on the input expense side? Is that like part of your research, or are you more focused on like the output pricing?
So I am looking at the cost of inputs. That's an area that I've kind of dug into actually quite recently. If you look at the real cost of production for almonds, pistachios, and walnuts, they've essentially, and again, this is the real cost, so adjusted for inflation, they've more or less doubled since 1990, which is kind of extraordinary, right? That means it's outstripped inflation by quite a bit. And so one of the things I'm looking at or trying to investigate more is really breaking down those costs and understanding where that trend is coming from. The first thing is water. That's probably not too surprising to any grower in California. Water is extremely scarce, but it's also extremely volatile. So right now, we're in a pretty good situation, but it's very hard for farmers to know what to put in for their per acre foot of water. The other thing is labor. So we've seen 4 minimum wage increases since the start of COVID, which is kind of wild. Whatever you think of this, it's increased quite a bit. It's doubled since 2013. So in a 10-year period, it's doubled. It's outstripped inflation, whereas the federal minimum wage hasn't outstripped inflation. It's trended below. So that's one thing. Part of that, there's been AB 1066, which was the change to the overtime law, which is in fact affecting a lot of growers as well. Again, no matter whatever you think of these are having a big impact on growers. And then the final thing is on the regulatory compliance side, which is a big part of California agriculture, is being regulatory compliant with across a lot of different dimensions. And so it's very hard to kind of narrow in and know what those costs increase have looked like over time. But there's an interesting survey that some Cal Poly professors did looking at this question, and they found that basically across the board, regulatory costs have gone up. It's been a bit different depending on commodity, depending on the size of the farm. But for small farms, so farms that are below 50 acres, it's gone up by about 150%. For medium-sized farms, so those that are 51 to 250 acres, it's gone up by 142%. And then for the big farms, so those that are bigger than 250 acres, it's gone up by 270%. So again, these are the compliance costs from 2012 to 2018 based on a survey. And again, this survey doesn't look at a whole bunch of growers because that's quite difficult to do. It looks at 22 growers throughout the Central Valley, just to give some context there. And in terms of where these compliance costs are coming from, it's really, again, it's across the board. A lot of it has to do with the Food Safety Modernization Act. A lot of it has to do with nitrogen management plans. There's a whole array of things that have just increased costs. And one thing I'll note about this is all 2012 to 2018. So this is mostly pre-Sigma. So when we're talking about GSA or GSP assessments, that's likely not included in most of these growers. So just that's important to keep in mind because that cost is certainly going to increase.
All right, Matt, now we need to talk about a timely topic, and that is the recent census. Tim and I have been texting back and forth about, different LinkedIn comments or posts about the census or Twitter or what have you, or articles. Would love to just get your thoughts on some of the kind of the major points, major takeaways from the recent census.
Yeah, well, I'm happy to hear that you guys are nerds like me. You text about those sorts of things. But yeah, the ag census, which it comes out every 5 years, came out quite recently. I think it was even Valentine's Day, maybe. I think it's important to keep in mind that this is only every 5 years. So when we're talking about a trend, we're often talking about just 2 points when people are comparing 2017 to 2022, for instance. And the other thing is it's from 2022 and we're in 2024. So a lot of times by the time it comes out, it's already a little out of date. But nevertheless, it's still really valuable, particularly how granular you can get with the data. You can get to the county level, which is pretty cool. In terms of the main trends, what I found interesting about all the trends is California is basically more dramatic in all these trends. So all the trends that people are talking about, California is experiencing them to a higher level or a higher percentage. So the first thing is that the number of farms declined and the number of farmland in farms declined. I think a lot of that has to do with urbanization. A lot of it has to do, at least in this state, with water. It's really kind of extraordinary that if you look at the actual numbers, so from 2017 to 2022, farms in California decreased by about 1.5%. And it doesn't sound like much, but that's roughly the size of the city of Los Angeles, which is, an interesting way to look at it. So that's one trend. I think that's likely to continue, as particularly in the Central Valley, we tend to grow out instead of up. So that suburban and urban development is likely to continue. The second trend is that consolidation seems to be continuing. So if you look at the size of farms, they tend to be increasing in size. That's at the national level and in California. And again, California, that's happening even more quickly, where you have a decline in the percentage of smaller farms and an increase in the percentage of big farms. Again, that ties into some of the regulatory topics in Sigma, where oftentimes it makes sense to spread those costs over many, many acres, right? So that's another trend. And then the one everyone likes to talk about is demographics. So, the age of farmers, I believe, it's something like 57. It might be 58, but it's somewhere in there. That's the average age of farmers in America. In California, that's slightly higher. There's been a lot of conversation about this online and saying, well, we've also seen an increase in, some of the younger groups. So I think 25 to 34 maybe increased, which is encouraging. But I still see this as a pretty major issue for the agriculture industry. Part of this is just because it's a generational industry. And then another part is that farmers obviously are in rural areas, which tend to be older than urban areas. But if you compare the ages of farmers to the civilian labor force more broadly, it's pretty astounding. So 6.6% of the U.S. labor force is over the age of 65, but 40% of farmers are over the age of 65. And for every one farmer that's between the ages of 25 to 34, there are two farmers that are over the age of 75. So I think it's going to be a challenge for the industry going forward, and it really just emphasizes the importance of succession planning. And I should just note too, this is not just happening at the farmer or manager level, but it's also happening with the farm worker labor force. It's also getting older and is also, has a lot more opportunities in urban areas and even in rural areas. And then I guess the final thing is on the renewable energy side. So we saw an uptick at the national level of the number of farms, or the percentage of farms using renewable energy systems on the farm. California has a much higher percentage of farms that are using renewable energy in one way or the other. And that's primarily driven by solar. But that's another trend that I noticed there that stood out.
Totally. Yeah, it's fun digging in. It just seems like the segmentation is so broad. Like we talked about the dentist that has 5 acres of cherries, that's kind of a passive side income. Like that's the same as a farm that's a dad and his sons working on the farm as their entire livelihood. So it's like really hard to kind of like compare apples to apples when like a farm looks so different in a lot of different situations, and kind of like look at the upper end of the segmentation. I think it's like the $1 million in revenue and $5 million revenue is the cutoffs. And that's less than 6% of farms in that bracket. And like would love to get more granular in like that segment in particular, and kind of like eliminate some of the more like lifestyle farms to like understand what's happening there.
Right. I mean, the definition of a farm, if you look at the definition of a farm, I think it's, over $1,000 in sales or something. It's pretty, that includes a lot of very, very small farms. So it's always important to keep that in mind.
So Matt, the census gets put out, like from a farmer's perspective, when I look at this, it's more of just kind of like, it's interesting. It's kind of benchmarking against other farms of kind of like where we sit, but like, what's the outcome of this report? Like what policy do you see, and like, how is it going to be impacted by the census?
It's difficult to know exactly what policy will come about from this. I thought it was interesting that Vilsack, called it a wake up call. I think referring particularly to consolidation and farmer ages. So I'm not quite sure, but there is a lot of conversation about how that's going to impact the farm bill in various ways. I think more generally of how it's going to impact the decisions that farmers make on the ground, and so we're seeing. Particularly in the Salinas Valley, we're seeing a lot of farmers moving towards automation in a really kind of intense way. So 70% of farmers are using automation in one way or the other, or spending on automation. The average spending on automation is $500,000 according to Western growers. So you can see the trend already happening, and growers are adapting and responding to that. And unsurprisingly, I think we're seeing it most intensely in the crops that are most labor intensive. So that at least addresses the demographic side.
All right, as we close this out here, Matt, I think a ton of just fascinating insights about where ag is, the markets, the census. I don't know, from your perspective, what is the path forward here for California farmers, or maybe just farmers, in general across the U.S.? We have all these headwinds, right? There's labor, there's rising costs of inputs, there's crashing commodity pricing, right? There's all these challenges that we're seeing, and there's no silver bullet. But some things that we talk about on this podcast are ag tech, right? Automation, like you mentioned. I think that's a really key one. There's regenerative ag and trying to be more thoughtful and mindful of soil health to potentially reduce input costs and water use. Then the other big one that we talk about is just business model, right? Of how can you go more direct to consumer to change the paradigm of the tough system. My dad always, says farming's the only business where you're buying retail and selling wholesale, right? So there's this just margin compression happening. Where is your head at about just the future of ag and where this is going and what farmers should be thinking about?
Yeah, well, that kind of gets back to the census. If you look at the counties that had the top ag production and in terms of value, it was mostly California, right? I think California counties represented the top 9 counties. In Fresno County, where I am, it has value that's over the value of 23 states, which is pretty impactful. There's a lot of ag going on down here, and so I think it's important to keep that in mind when we have these conversations and talk about these challenges. I think with regards to the permanent plantings, those prices are going to start going up. We've already started to see that. I think we're really experiencing the worst of it right now, but we will get out of it. And I just get really excited about different opportunities to grow different commodities and market them in different ways. So I think about our own family farm. We've experimented with agave, for instance. I have some friends who are experimenting with tepary beans, which are a native bean to the Arizona area, which take very, very little water. And they're thinking about ways to plant and grow those. So I think there's a positive sign out there and trying to experiment with new commodities. And then on the marketing side, I don't want to go into naming names too much because I don't want to leave anyone out. But there's a lot of really exciting direct to consumer farm companies out there that are marketing commodities in ways that don't make them seem like commodities, which is very cool. And so I'm really excited about those kinds of opportunities. And it may mean farming looks a little bit different, or in terms of where those profit margins are really coming from might be a bit different. But I think whenever you have kind of a moment like this in California agriculture, which is really challenging, there's also a lot of opportunity, and it's important to keep that in mind.
Totally. Some light at the end of the tunnel, and we'll end on a positive note. Matt, this has been a ton of fun. As we wrap up, how can our listeners get in touch and connect with you and everything you're doing at Terrain?
Yeah, so you can go to terrainag.com, and we're always very responsive to email, and that's the best way to reach me.
So, Tim, what do you think?
super fun conversation with Matt. Just was awesome hearing his background coming into the research side of agriculture and really having a passion there, just diving into these topics. It's nice to kind of like separate the coffee shop gossip from like what's actually happening, and to have someone like Matt that's actually doing these observations, running the analysis to really explain what's happening in walnuts, what's happening in almonds. You kind of just hear like, oh, almonds are busted, they're done, they're not going to come back. And it's like, oh, there's actually a couple things driving this, and it is going to turn around in 2025 and has a better outlook. So I think it was just awesome hearing from Matt.
This is why we need podcasts, Tim, right? It's like to dig into this stuff and to avoid the tweet or the coffee shop chatter. I guess the tweeting is like today's version of that, of just like clickbait and uninformed opinions. That's why I love just digging in this format. Was a ton of fun. Well, guys, thanks so much for tuning in. If you haven't checked out the story of the wonderful company, be sure to do it. It was released last week. Hope you enjoy that. We'll link it in the show notes if you haven't listened to that one already.